According to this radical philosophy, the moment you successfully claim dominion over your private property, you stop being merely a human being
Yeah.
and you start becoming something else entirely. You start becoming a world eater. Welcome to Doctrines of the Absurd, your provider of belief on demand. We are here for a deep dive, tailored just for you. Okay, so let's unpack this. Our sources today present a fiercely critical alternative history of the West.
It's a really challenging one. The core idea is that the whole narrative of progress, the great march toward modernity,
Right.
it's actually defined by this successful systemic extermination of human resistance.
So we're diving deep into this intellectual narrative of the great predatory system, what the source material calls the Leviathan, and I guess the human component that just naturally fought back against it.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating is that the author isn't really interested in a traditional history of, kings and queens.
No, this is something else.
The core human problem being addressed is what they call the immiseration and maiming of people.
Yeah.
This is all caused by these accelerating leviathanic transformations happening in early Europe.
So it's not about battles. It's about the feeling of being crushed.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's capturing that essential, painful psychological tension of being steamrolled by a system you can barely even understand. We're tracking the friction between, on one hand, a totally natural human response to dehumanization, and on the other, the cold, calculated, and frankly lethally progressive machinery of this emerging Western system.
And to really get our heads around how this machinery operates, the source material argues we have to accept a core binary, a fundamental split. On one side, you've got resistance. This is described as organic, entirely human, and a necessary response to being crushed.
Wow.
Physically, economically, spiritually.
And on the other side,
We have Leviathanic progress,
Yep.
the coherent, deadly, and systematic accumulation of authority, commerce, and repression. And the core thesis, the real engine of the argument, is that authority always manages to win this fight. Not just with brute strength, but through this brilliant psychological maneuver, deflection.
that's it. That is the engine room of this entire argument. It's an incredibly harsh, cynical view, but it's also intellectually stimulating.
It really is.
The claim is that authority, so the church, the emerging monarchies, their financial backers, they never actually solve the internal conflict. They don't solve the genuine rage of the dispossessed or the reality of their suffering.
But what do?
They just redirect that lethal energy. It's brilliant in a terrifying way. They turn the violence outward against some shifting external target, or, and this is the most cynical move of all, they turn it inward against the very person who is suffering.
So this concept of deflection, it's the master key. It's how the Leviathan built the modern West.
It is. So we've got these two forces locked in a kind of mortal combat. We need to look at both sides.
Let's start with the human side of that binary then. Let's talk about resistance.
Sounds good.
The source material kicks off with this premise that almost acts as a rhetorical shield for the rebels.
How so?
It states that resistance is the natural human response to dehumanization. Full stop.
Ah, okay.
So therefore, it doesn't need some complex explanation or, moral justification. It just is.
That starting point is so crucial because it completely flips the historical script, doesn't it?
It really does.
If resistance is just a natural reflex like pulling your hand away from a hot stove, then the whole burden of proof shifts.
Right. You don't have to spend pages and pages justifying why a peasant was right to revolt.
Exactly. Instead, you have to spend all your time defending why the lords and the clergy were acting like these profit-crazed supervisors in the first place, abandoning all the old social contracts just for mercantile gain.
And we see this resistance popping up all over early Europe. It's not a unified political party or anything like that.
No, it's spontaneous, it's visceral. Grassroots defiance.
The sources give some fantastic examples of this initial friction. You have peasants forming their own self-defense leagues because all of a sudden their lords are prioritizing commercial profit over the ancient rhythm of the community. It's the breaking of a social covenant.
Absolutely. And you see the exact same thing in the emerging industrial workforce. Weavers, the skilled labor that was essential to the rising merchant class, they start turning against the very merchants who are hiring them.
Why?
Because they recognize them as the direct source of their exploitation. They aren't turning against some far-off king. They're turning against the immediate mechanism of their own immiseration, which is, the merchant's ledger book.
But the animosity seems most widespread, most visible toward the church hierarchy. The sources really highlight them as the primary trafficker in both spiritual and worldly goods.
That specific focus is a key insight. The example of the Flanders townspeople is so revealing.
Tell us about that.
Well, they weren't just mad that the church was wealthy. They were withholding tithes and actually attacking priests because they saw that the ecclesiastics were the grossest of the traffickers.
So the church wasn't seen as separate from these new commercial forces.
Not at all. It was seen as the most ruthless corporate entity in this new market economy, selling spiritual products for enormous profit.
Which brings us to Tantalms of Antwerp. I think this anecdote, it really deserves a moment because it just encapsulates the righteous fury of the resistance so perfectly.
Tantalm's rhetoric was profoundly effective because it was so simple and so direct. He didn't just disagree with the Pope, he verbally incinerated the entire institution.
What did he say?
He called the church a brothel, and he specifically named the priests and the Pope himself as its pimps.
Wow.
As people who sell the sacred, they sell saints, they sell apostles, they sell absolutions, all for a fee. This is the language of immediate moral condemnation, not some polite theological critique.
It's the language of a person who has watched their community get exploited and is just naming the machine.
Exactly, naming the machine.
And this defiance wasn't just in the cities, right? We hear about the dispossessed peasants in Brittany, for example, who carried this deeply ingrained, long tradition of glorified violence. They were seen by the prelates as a genuine, terrifying existential threat.
How serious a threat?
They were seen as being capable of sweeping priests, abbots, and maybe even the Pope out of Europe entirely. That's not a local nuisance, that's a continental threat.
Which is why the source material really emphasizes this element of inspiration. The forms of resistance, while organic, they're often inspired by these earlier forgotten examples.
Right. Whether it's Moravian cultivators forming leagues against Leviathanic incursions, or the Flemings taking their cue from the priest's own hypocritical actions, the seeds of defiance just need fertile ground. And the accelerating dehumanization provided that in spades.
So if the resistance is this natural human response, the system's longevity, its survival, depends entirely on crushing, or more subtly, deflecting that response.
Let's look at the church's two-pronged psychological master strategy for dealing with all this internal violence.
Okay. First, you have the strategy of internalizing violence.
The relentless focus on sin.
Exactly. Why? Because, structurally, the doctrine of sin is a mechanism to make people turn the violence inward against themselves.
So if I believe the misery I feel is my fault, or Adam's fault,
then you focus all your energy on personal penance, on repentance, on self-control, rather than on, systemic revolution against the actual source of your suffering.
But self-repression can only work for so long. When that internal pressure builds up too much, or when external resistance like Tantalm's movement becomes too strong, they pivot.
And that's the second strategy, externalizing violence, or as you said, deflection.
This is the genius of the Crusade.
It is. The Pope proclaims a holy war against unbelievers precisely to deflect the violence, to turn it against others. The rage that should have been directed against the wealthy Catholic prelates, or Rome, or the local lord.
It gets redirected toward a distant, conveniently demonized target.
The cynic in this text tracks the shifting targets of this deflection. First, it was communities of Saxons. Then, when that was exhausted, it was local Jewish communities, a convenient, internal, yet non-Christian target.
And only then did it shift to distant Arabs.
The sheer flexibility of the target proves the purpose was never theological purity. It was always about internal security, about maintaining the status quo by just venting the pressure cooker outward.
The text says the ultimate strategic goal was to turn the violence of the resistors against resistors themselves.
Which is the final and most costly feat of deflection.
And this strategic deflection brings us right to the intellectual villain of this whole narrative, the serious scholar who writes what the text calls his story.
With a capital H-I-S.
Exactly. The sources introduce Norman Cohn, described rather pointedly as a friend of authority, law and order.
Cohn's historical project, as it's framed here, was explicitly ideological. His mission was to document a millennium of resistance movements while at the same time maligning every episode of it.
That is the definition of his story. History written exclusively by those who take the Pope and all figures of authority, especially the police, at their word.
So in this frame, the authorities' narrative is always the positive evidence, and the rebels' words, their reasons, their lived misery.
That's all just discounted as delusion or pathology.
Yeah.
It's the ultimate defense of the Leviathan. The source material is scathing about Cohn's extreme conclusion, which basically depicts the entire history of resistance as a precursor to the Nazi Party.
The unstated implication being that every rebel is a Hitler.
Yes. The academic contortions required to defend authority are just incredible. The text gives this striking example. Pope Urban II calls on people to turn the weapons which you have stained unlawfully in the slaughter of one another against the enemies of the faith.
A pretty clear call to redirect violence.
You'd think. But Cohn, the serious scholar, feels he has to pretend the Pope didn't really mean it. He has to sanitize the act, claiming the Pope was just trying to restore peace at home.
Instead of admitting the church was cynically redirecting mass violence for political gain.
Right. Or the anecdote about the bishop who lodges a persecuted Jewish supplier in his servant quarters. Cohn presents this as the bishop being appalled by the violence, a champion of moral order.
But the source material reframes it completely.
It says the bishop is just relieved that the violence is turning against the unbeliever's house instead of his own palace. It's calculated self-preservation dressed up as pious morality.
And this intellectual deflection, it continues right into the modern age.
We see that parallel drawn so clearly. Professors who benefit from the state university who, as the text chillingly puts it, massacre Vietnamese peasants from desks, will pretend to be horrified by the soldiers, the Callies, who turn their words into lethal deeds.
But their true rage is reserved for the resistors who turn their weapons against the instruments of authority itself.
So the high stakes here aren't just about historical accuracy. They're existential. If we accept his story, we perform this final intellectual act of deflection. We heap authority's own violence, which was intentionally deflected, onto the heads of the very rebels who were fighting back.
And in doing that, we lose the core memory of resistance itself, which the text calls the only human component of the entire story.
All the rest, the massacres, the expropriation, the systemic buildup,
That's all just Leviathanic progress.
that intellectual framework sets the stage perfectly for the largest and most profound human resistance movement Europe had yet seen. The Cathars, or Albigensians, in the 11th and 12th centuries.
And what's really fascinating is that this huge ideological movement came from the East, almost mirroring the sources of the new commerce and wealth that were fueling the Leviathan's growth in the first place.
It established itself right in the wealthy, highly commercialized heart of Frankdom and Travasse. This was an ideological phenomenon that couldn't be easily suppressed.
No. The Cathars were initially inspired by the Bulgarian Bogomils, and this is where we find what the text calls the Zarathustrian strain. These are concepts of radical dualism that actually predate the Christian crisis cult.
Let's pause on that jargon for a second because this is crucial. When we talk about Zarathustrian strain or Manichaeanism, what are we really talking about?
We're talking about a fundamentally different view of good and evil than what the Catholic Church was selling. It's not just a small theological disagreement.
It's a different operating system.
Exactly. To simplify, they saw the entire world as a literal battlefield between two independent co-eternal forces, light, which is good, and darkness, which is evil.
And critically, this battle was happening right now on this earth, in this political system.
Not in some future distant Christian heaven. It was immediate and it was political.
So this movement was fundamentally anti-Christian, not just a Christian heresy. It drew its insights from all over Islamic Persia, the steppes, Byzantine sailors, migrating Italians, until the whole region Provence was just teeming with these latter-day Manichaeans.
And their goal wasn't just to reform the church, it was to expose it as the domain of evil. They translated the sacred Christian book into the local Provençal language. Not to recover some lapsed piety, but to prove that the anti-Roman crisis cult described in the original texts had absolutely nothing to do with the vicar and his bishops, abbots, and priests.
So they were trying to reclaim the original text from the institution.
Yes. They accepted Christ, but only as one prophet among many. They believed the prophetic gift was continuous, not confined to a single person or a single time.
And the reason the Cathars became such an existential threat wasn't just their numbers, it was their near total immunity to the church's entire repressive apparatus.
This is the strategic genius of their anti-Pauline doctrine. The entire Catholic mechanism of control relies on the doctrine of guilt and sin, right?
Right.
Well, if you have no use for the guilt-inspired doctrine of sin, then all the tools the church uses for social control, confessions, pardons, excommunications, selling absolutions, they all become totally meaningless to you.
They had effectively inoculated themselves against Leviathan's main psychological weapon.
Completely. Guilt was off the table.
And this rejection forced them to redefine sin and evil entirely. Their greatest sin wasn't some historical fall of Adam.
No, it was the active, present-day misery of the dispossessed, which they attributed directly to the rapacity of commercializing lords, priests, and monks. They named the profiteers as the evildoers.
So they adopted Christian terms, good and evil, but they filled them with Zarathustrian content.
Exactly. Good became Ahura Mazda, or light. Evil became Ahriman, or darkness. This sophisticated framework allowed them to place the entire existing Catholic system crusading Europe's dominion firmly in the camp of evil.
They defined the present as an era of darkness.
And their goal was deeply political. They wanted evil to be defeated and dismembered in Gaul itself right now, not waiting for some distant promised salvation.
And the Cathar spirit was infectious. It fueled this radical intellectual environment that inspired other movements like the Vaudois, the Poor Men of Lyons, and the Humiliati in Italy.
And what's important is that even the groups that remain nominally Catholic, they shared the core anti-Leviathanic beliefs.
They all rejected the church hierarchy.
And the doctrine of sin and purgation and the whole apparatus of selling pardons. Most crucially, they rejected the idea that the dispossession of Europe's once free peasantry was somehow natural or God-ordained.
The realization that the system was artificial and rapacious, that was the ideological kindling.
It was. And this radical fire even reached deep into the church's own administration, transforming a high-ranking Cistercian monk, Joachim of Fiore. He had a revelation that was directly inspired by these anti-Catholic contemporaries.
Joachim is one of the most significant figures in this alternative history because he takes the Zarathustrian sequence of ages and applies it to the Catholic world.
He turns the church's own historical narrative against itself. He posits 3 ages: the age of the father, which was fear and servitude, so early Judaism, then the age of the son, submission to the church, and then the imminent 3rd age, the age of the spirit,
characterized by love, joy, and freedom.
The implication of this schema was utterly seismic for the established order. I mean, if the age of the sun was ending.
Then the church was not the kingdom of God on earth, as St. Augustine had taught.
Exactly. Therefore, all the accomplishments of crusading Europe, the expropriating, the commercializing, they weren't signs of the kingdom's arrival. They were clear, terrifying signs of the last days of the current corrupt system.
And he didn't just stop at theology. He made a specific time-bound prediction.
He did. He said the Antichrist, who he identified as Frederick II, a rapacious mercantile monarch, would destroy the corrupt church 3.5 years before the end of the Second Age.
And then immediately after, he too would be swept away by liberated humanity.
Which provided the resistance with an actual expiration date for the Leviathan, legitimized by a high-ranking cleric using the church's own sources. That level of threat, it required more than just deflection. It required co-option.
Okay, let's pivot from high theology to the individual. The source material asks this fundamental psychological question.
Cool.
Why do some people choose to resist, while others, who are just as familiar with the system's rapacity, remain unmoved?
And the answer is simple. Resistance disrupts your entire life. It requires a profound internal metamorphosis.
You need very good reasons,
Yeah.
expressed in the language of the time. In the 12th century, a massive shift like that was framed as a revelation or a visitation.
And the text is provocative here. It suggests that in our modern age, we'd probably just dismiss this transformation as a complete mental breakdown.
But the internal experience is one of radical clarity. The individual moves from a life where everything was noise and nothing had meaning, which sounds a lot like modern alienation, doesn't it?
It does, and suddenly, for them, everything is clear. They leave the sequence of meaningless intervals of Leviathanic time, and they recover the genuine natural rhythms of non-Leviathanic communities.
It's an argument that the system imposes this meaningless, linear, artificial existence.
And to resist is to reclaim authentic, meaningful time. And this is precisely why the Leviathanic historians have to malign and discount these experiences. They cannot allow for the possibility that authority is just meaningless noise, and that the resistors found truth in their supposed madness.
Their main tool is always contempt and ridicule. Look at Norman Cohn again. The sources highlight that Cohn deliberately focuses on the pathological nature of those guided by their own dreams and visions.
He aims to pathologize the very moment of human clarity that the resistance depends on.
And the armored reader, the loyal subject of the Leviathan, automatically shares this contempt. They assume that only the revelations of judges, popes, or state-sanctioned scholars have any validity.
As the text summarizes, the system has successfully trained its subjects to conclude that their duly constituted authorities are the only possible saviors of mankind. The Leviathan itself is the only possible messiah. The system has internalized its own definition of sanity into the minds of its subjects.
So given the scale of the Cathar and humiliati threat, the Church realized that simple deflection wasn't going to be enough. They needed a strategic countermove that would absorb and neutralize the energy of resistance.
This is the master strategy of recuperation.
The text describes it brilliantly as using the ancient Persian trick of repressing Zarathustrians by wearing the mantle of Ahura Mazda.
You neutralize the enemy not by defeating their ideals, but by stealing them.
The ultimate example of this is St. Francis, Giovanni de Bernardone. He was the perfect potential resistor. He abandoned wealth, he preached radical poverty, community, kinship with nature.
In any other generation, he would have been Tanchel. He would have been a target for extermination.
But Pope Innocent III was a master strategist. He invited and sponsored Francis.
And this is recuperation. The Church pretends to be everything its enemies are. So individuals who are inclined to resist, the ideal recruits for the Cathars, they get drawn into the Franciscan order, which on the outside looks and acts exactly like an authentic resistance movement.
But the outcome, according to these sources, was a profound betrayal.
It was. Once they were inside the order, the vast majority of Franciscans were swiftly molded into a heresy police. The pure energy of resistance was channeled directly into internal repression.
Even Francis himself realized the deception too late.
His death, marked by the stigmata, is interpreted here as a final, desperate, nonverbal message. A message that his life had been deflected and betrayed by the very institution that appeared to embrace him.
His spiritual purity was used to forge the first modern police force.
And the Church recuperated even that final act. They turned Francis into a saint and his order into a cudgel against resistors.
The chilling takeaway here is that this was the definitive moment when the metamorphosis of liberation partisans into policemen and jailers became common.
A phenomenon that the source material suggests later generations wouldn't even find remarkable, but which was an abominable corruption of the human spirit in that era.
So the Franciscan recuperation was the internal defense mechanism. But at the same time, the Church launched its external technological offense, the Dominican order.
The Dominicans were the intellectual shock troops, and their description in the source material is terrifyingly clinical.
Their founder was characterized as a human clock.
And their recruits as flesh and blood filing cabinets. This is the technological order. Their entire aim was to impose the regularity of clockwork on all social life. They were the architects of the Inquisition.
They treated nature and human nature with instruments of torture.
For them, correct faith, like correct time, was just a matter of adjusting springs and wheels. The organic, messy human resistance of the Cathars was met with the cold, systematic, administrative precision of a lethal bureaucracy.
And once this two-part repressive apparatus was complete, Franciscans turning resistors against other resistors, Dominicans running the torture chambers, the Pope proclaimed the Albigensian Crusade.
This was the holy war launched against domestic unbelievers.
The result was total annihilation. Louis VIII, the Parisian lion, led the Christian crusaders. All the Albigensian towns were destroyed.
A whole population was exterminated, hunted down like animals. This wasn't a localized riot. This was a state-sponsored ethnic and ideological cleansing. It was about ideological purity and profound material gain.
And this is where we hit the critical aha moment of this section. The Parisian lion expropriated his victims' lands and wealth, and in doing so, he became king of a nation-sized realm, France.
And the source material states unequivocally that this crusade against internal dissent, proclaimed and executed by authorities, is the structural forerunner of the Nazi crusade against the Jews.
The entire system that emerged from this period crusading Europe, which turned piety and spiritual conviction into tools for crass, large-scale expropriation, is defined as the modern West.
Everything that follows, the text asserts, is simply more of the same hypocrisy, which will later be called reason and science, and more of the same psychological armor, which will later be called technology.
The foundation of the West is literally built upon the exterminated bodies of its own rebels.
Having perfectly deflected their rage.
So, The Albigensian Crusade gave us the French nation-state, a new model of the Leviathan in the south. But the sources show that the exact same lethal process of integrating repression and commerce was happening at the same time in the north.
Right. It was creating an equally coherent and dangerous new force. We shift our focus to the Teutonic Knights.
The plundering holy warriors of the north.
Exactly. The equivalent of the Crusaders in the south. But their power came from a fundamental difference. They were inextricably linked to the rising mercantile rulers of the Hanseatic League cities.
These knights were operating as the original conquistadors and pioneers of the European project. They were already engaged in mass expropriation and environmental despoliation in response to new commercial opportunities.
Even though they hadn't yet discovered America, their targets were the natives on their eastern borders. Turkic-speaking Finns, Baltic-speaking Lithuanians, and Prussians.
And their mission was both economic and military.
Exterminate the indigenous populations, expropriate their lands, and resettle those lands with domesticated German Catholics who would serve as the labor base for the Hansa merchants.
The result was the complete, systematic elimination of the wilderness, transforming new worlds into the old world.
They often eliminated the people entirely, leaving only the name of the indigenous group surviving, as happened with Prussia.
And this reveals a terrifying new element in warfare. Previous military segments, like Charlemagne's Franks, they could be fought and maybe held at bay.
Or they might just run out of money. But the Teutonic Order cannot easily be stopped.
Why not?
The text asserts it's because of its connection to that network of commercial cities. This connection gave the Teutonic militarists a financial and logistical continuity that their predecessors totally lacked.
So the knights might lose battles.
But the war just keeps going, funded by the commercial imperative. It continues until the entire wilderness, physical and human, is reduced to forms that are susceptible to commercial manipulation by the merchants. This is that lethal fusion we need to analyze.
The unholy marriage of burghers and knights.
That's it. And this functional fusion required resolving this ancient geopolitical contradiction. Historically, mercantile power, the octopus like the Phoenicians, and militaristic power, the worm, like the Assyrians, were mortal enemies.
The octopus might trade with the worm, but if the worm's claw ever touched the octopus's ship,
it was immediate destruction. But the European burghers of the Hanseatic League, Venice, Genoa, they achieved what the ancient Phoenicians could not. They actively cooperated with and strategically made use of the military worm segments.
So let's detail the mechanism of this unholy marriage.
The burghers provisioned the military machines for all the Crusades, against the Albigensians, the Muslims, the Balts. They treated the military as a captive market, plundering them for enormous profits. The military was the single greatest customer the emerging commercial system had.
And in return, the knights performed two vital functions for them.
They secured new sources of exploitable materials, and they exterminated the human obstacles to commercial exploitation. It was a mutual exploitation agreement that benefited the mercantile side far, far more than the noble side.
The mercantile bride entered this marriage fully aware of its profitability. But the noble, lordly husband,
he was, according to the text, obtuse. He failed to realize that he was effectively digging his own grave with the capital provided by his new partners.
The burghers were systematically wringing the nobility dry.
They appropriated the wealth squeezed from the serfs and eventually took their lodges, their lands, even their ancestral names, all of it achieved through the mechanism of commodity exchange, through loans and transactions.
And the lords were blinded by their archaic code of martial honor.
And crucially, the entire arrangement was sealed by the blessing of the Catholic Church.
The children of this marriage, the sources conclude, ensured the continuity of Peter's dominion. The knight enforcing with spears, the burgher controlling with commodities, and the priest legitimizing with words. The key to heaven remained firmly in the family.
But the power dynamic had completely inverted.
And the source material offers this chilling postscript. Even when the aristocratic military machines eventually went extinct, the burghers didn't suffer.
They just launched military machines of their own, what we later call bourgeois revolutions. But even then, they didn't fight themselves. They preferred to hire professional killers, treating their own military just like they treated the crusading establishment.
As a highly profitable market to reap windfall profits from.
The mechanism remains perfectly consistent.
So even with this incredibly profitable marriage, the emerging Western system was still full of internal conflicts. The worm-like military segments were constantly trying to swallow the octopus-like mercantile tentacles.
A conflict the source material notes goes on to this very day.
The burghers, who were terrified of being devoured, would constantly search for champions, kings, or emperors to protect them from the aristocratic worm.
But often they would find themselves encased by the very worm they paid for. The conflict gets complicated because the forms of the Leviathan are constantly blurring and metamorphosing.
We see this blurring everywhere. Norman England is a classic example. It expelled Jewish merchants and acted as a fierce mercantile tentacle toward Gaul and Italy.
Yet, internally, it was an incredibly militaristic worm toward the Welsh, Scots, and Irish. It was both the octopus and the worm, depending on its target.
And the papal see itself is the ultimate contradiction. It aspired to be the sole worm, the all-encompassing empire.
Dreaming of rehabilitating the defunct Roman beast, but in its daily secular practices, it acted exactly like a rapacious mercantile octopus, trading and profiteering without conscience.
The crucial observation here is that up until this point, historical leviathans, like the Roman or Syrian empires, could be pretty easily categorized as either primarily military or primarily mercantile.
But in the West, these two forms became so fundamentally intertwined that the resulting beast was something the world had never seen before. It's a composite of previously incompatible elements that, unlike the clumsy Frankish Roman Empire, forms a single, coherent, functioning machine.
The Roman Pope might have provided the initial ideological justification, but the beast that emerged was ultimately out of the Pope's control.
The logic of the machine profit and extermination had superseded the piety of its creators.
Now we look at the final remnants of the Catholic Empire as they solidify into the two key blueprints for modernity, the French Kingdom and the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
The French Kingdom, stabilized by the Albigensian Crusade and the expropriation that followed, is the model for the modern nation-state.
Governed by a strongman, the King of Parisians, who became the King of France. And crucially, this entity immediately moved to reduce the ecumenical ecclesia Catholicism to a mere French spiritual police force.
King Philip IV provided the prime example by installing his own pope in Provence, essentially reducing Catholicism to a national department of ideology and propaganda.
The sources suggest this strategic move effectively anticipates the Protestant Reformation by centuries. The state asserts control over the church apparatus.
This French monarchy, the royal worm, was explicitly supported by the bourgeoisie, the tentacles, as a shield against the smaller aristocratic worm segments.
And that alliance permanently cemented the kingdom's reliance on commerce. The monarchy was inserted into this vast empire of commodity exchange, meaning the French ruler was now dependent on costs, prices, and commercial crises. The fate of the state was now fundamentally linked to the market stability.
And on the other side, you have the Holy Roman Empire.
Stabilized by the Hohenstaufen and Habsburg dynasties, it was far more anachronistic. The author argues it was a sequel not to Charlemagne's Romantic Empire, but to Otto's frontier cudgel against Slavic communities.
It's best understood as a giant, perpetually operating real estate operation.
Its entire existence was about continuous land acquisition, to acquire, hold, and lease lands. The sources suggest its proper name should have been Rudolfiana or Albertingia, named after its changing list of landlords.
Because its entire purpose was sustained by a military of serf-holding retainers focused on expansion.
Yet it remained holy because it continued to be Christianity's physical cudgel against Slavic, Baltic, and Turkic peoples. It continuously transformed powerful regions like Moravia and Bohemia into simple, profit-generating imperial estates.
And the ultimate purpose of all these seizures and confiscations.
It's rooted in the biblical command that justifies the entire enterprise, to have dominion over the fish and over the fowl and over everything that moveth upon the appropriated land.
That dominion, that absolute control, is what filters down.
It is.
And that brings us to the final, terrifying conceptual leap made in this text, the democratization of dominion.
This is where it gets really dark.
The high purpose of the emperor and the wealth-snatching of the burghers, it didn't stay confined to the elite. The ideology filtered down to every single European.
It creates a new ideological basis for self-respect that replaces the lost connection to organic community. The European ideal is summed up in the saying, "Every man is emperor in his own house."
And that house can range wildly in size, from a serf's hut to a nation-sized estate. But the underlying psychological ambition is the same.
Absolute dominion over private property, a personal Leviathan.
And this ambition is underpinned by generations of internal psychological preparation. Converted and enserfed Europeans had centuries of training and dominion over their sinful selves, chaining their emotions, their desires, their urges.
They had internalized the deflection mechanism perfectly. They had become domesticated, maimed, and most importantly, heavily armored.
The irony is powerful. Some of these armored Europeans did try to regain their lost humanity, becoming the true heirs to the Cathars.
But many others, perhaps the majority, became so heavily armored and repressed that they hungered to repress other sinful beings as he has repressed himself. They became willing, enthusiastic agents of the system that maimed them.
So the final definition of a self-respecting Christian becomes inextricably linked to this ideal of ownership and control.
Dominion over everything that moveth on a privately owned piece of real estate is what defines them.
And this gives us the ultimate definition, the critical final state of the domesticated European. A person who has accepted this premise of unending expropriation, beginning with themselves, is henceforth, and by definition, a world eater.
The world eater is the individual manifestation of Leviathanic progress, the human component that accepts, embodies, and perpetuates the mechanism of repression and expropriation. They have been trained to mistake their private, limited dominion for true freedom.
This analysis circles back to the foundational high stakes, the apparatus for extermination and expropriation crusading Europe, fueled by deflection, recuperation, and the Burgonite marriage, is the modern West.
And the text warns us, everything that follows is just more of the same hypocrisy.
The core predatory mechanism doesn't change, only the labels used to sanitize it. The sources predict that this inherent unavoidable hypocrisy will later be called reason and science,
providing a sterile, logical mantle for crude expropriation and conquest, and the internal psychological armor worn by the world eater will be rebranded as technology. The machine simply changes its surface plating and its language.
And to demonstrate that the ultimate cynicism was already present at the very moment the modern West was being forged, the text ends with one of the most shocking anecdotes of this entire deep dive.
It notes that even the cynicism of later merchants will not surpass the merchants who cashed in on the original crusading fervor by organizing a children's crusade.
They didn't just profit by provisioning the soldier.
No, they actively marketed the displacement of violence.
Wait, let's make sure we understand this correctly. Are you saying the foundation of Western finance is built on selling crusading children?
That is precisely the assertion. The merchants transported the piously bloodthirsty youngsters and sold them directly to Levantine slave dealers.
It was a purely commercial transaction,
turning profound religious fervor and misguided youth into pure commodity. This grotesque avarice, capitalizing on the very psychological deflection the church had engineered, serves as the perfect final punctuation mark on the foundation of the modern West.
The ultimate cynicism realized. The system sold its own youth to its enemies for cash. Let's quickly review the three biggest, most radical shifts we uncovered in this history of Western progress and resistance. First, we saw the master strategy of deflection.
The transformation of internal righteous human energy into external sanctioned violence via the doctrine of sin in the Crusades.
Second, we uncovered the chilling strategy of recuperation absorbing the threat, exemplified by the co-option of St. Francis.
Right. Turning potential rebellion into a powerful tool of repression, literally turning liberation partisans into the world's first ideological police.
And finally, we witnessed the emergence of the new Western Leviathan, a functional, legal composite machine driven by that highly profitable, unholy marriage between the militaristic worms and the mercantile octopuses.
A beast entirely dependent on commodity crisis and constant expropriation.
To make this entire historical argument stick, let's return to our master analogy.
The MMORPG.
Right. Think of a massive, globally successful online game. The Leviathan is the game studio, maximizing profits through endless updates and microtransactions.
And the players who revolt against the grinding, the exploitation, the alienation, they're the resistance.
So the studio authority, it doesn't fix the core problem. It relabels the rebels as griefers or trolls. That's the Cone strategy.
And then it launches a massive cash grab event, say a holy war raid, that channels all that player energy and rage against a common external enemy. This ensures the studio's own progress, its own profitable system, continues unchecked while the players exhaust themselves fighting phantoms.
The ultimate lesson here, the defining summary, and really the most powerful sentence in the text, is this. The resistance is the only human component of the entire history. All the rest is Leviathanic progress.
So if the decision to resist involves a mental breakdown or a revelation that allows you to step outside of Leviathanic time, the relentless noise and meaninglessness of the system, what form does that necessary mental break take in our hyper-connected, hyper-mediated modern age? Where is the untamed human moment hiding when the Leviathan has grown so vast that it can monetize the outrage and absorb the rebellion before it even begins? That is the question for you to explore as you move through this world.